Settling in, everybody. This evening, Kristina will offer the Dhamma talk, and I will, prior to her offering the Dhamma talk, will offer the refuges and precepts. So if you need the printout of it, please get it in front of you. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sambuddhassa. Buddham saranam gacchami. Dhammam saranam gacchami. Sangham saranam gacchami. Dutiyampi buddham saranam gacchami. Dutiyampi dhammam saranam gacchami. Dutiyampi sangham saranam gacchami. Tatiyampi buddham saranam gacchami. Tatiyampi dhammam saranam gacchami. Tatiyampi sangham saranam gacchami. Panatipata veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Adina dana veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Abrahmacharya veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Musawada veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Sura Naraya Majapamadhatana veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Vikala Bhojana veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Nacha Gita Wadita Visukadasana Malaganda Vilepana Dharana Mandana Vipusanatana veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Uchasayana Mahasayana veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. Idam me silam maga palanyanasa pachayo otu.
So I call this talk tonight, The Bliss of Blamelessness. So yesterday, Marcia offered this beautiful talk on Samvega, this sense of spiritual urgency, inner calling that really launches us onto this path towards liberation. And one could say that this Samvega in some ways is an initiator for this path to begin. And as Marcia was pointing to, it keeps giving us energy and fueling us along this path all the way up to liberation. Another really important foundation for this path is the practice of Sila. As many of you know, the Buddha divided this practice of this path of liberation into 3 trainings. The first is the training in Sila, often translated as moral restraint, ethical behavior, or virtue. The second is the training in Samadhi, or unification of mind. And then the third is the training in Panya, or liberating wisdom. So as you know, the majority of this treat will really be focused on developing Samadhi and developing wisdom. So in this talk, I wanted to give more attention to Sila as it's so foundational in the Buddha's teachings. Often we're really not aware of the tremendous importance here in the West. We tend to focus more on concentration and insight. And often we dive right into meditation without first developing a deep ethical foundation of Sila. Yet as we move deeper into the practice, we see that the other trainings really build on this foundation of Sila, this foundation of morality. And we see that all the trainings are deeply connected, and that each type of training really supports and strengthens the other parts. So one way to think about the 3 trainings is as a gradual purification process. And what we're gradually purifying through Sila, Samadhi, and Panya are all the ways that we cause harm both inwardly and outwardly. So through this practice, we're purifying our hearts and our minds of all the internal and external manifestations of the 3 poisons that Marcia talked about yesterday: greed, hatred, and delusion. This process of purification becomes increasingly more subtle as we move through the 3 trainings. On the Sila level, we're doing the rough work of relinquishing the external manifestations of this greed, hatred, and delusion. We clean up all the ways that we cause harm to others and to ourselves with our speech and with our behaviors. Taking the precepts that we just did is a really good example of this type of Sila practice. And then on the Samadhi and the Panya level, we then begin to do the much more subtle work of relinquishing all the inner manifestations of greed, hatred, and delusion. But first, we have to really also work on the outer level with our behaviors and with our speech. And this is the beautiful path to freedom that Marcia was pointing to yesterday. So before we move further into exploring Sila, I wanted to acknowledge that talking about moral restraint can sometimes feel a little bit heavy, maybe in particular for many of us in the West. There can be some cultural or spiritual conditioning that colors our experience of the topic of morality and virtue. So for some of us, it can be associated with a sense of guilt or shame, or connected with fears of somehow being a sinner, being bad in the eyes of God. So I know that the topic of Sila for me in the beginning did have this more heaviness to it early on in my practice. Yet as I was preparing for this talk around Sila, there was this tremendous joy that arose in my mind and my heart, and I was actually surprised by how much joy came up for me. It was almost like connecting with an old beloved friend. And there was a visceral sense of uplift, a sense of expansion in the chest, and a brightness in the mind. And I could see that the relationship with Sila had really shifted through the years from being a little bit heavy to now giving rise to this joy and this lightness in the mind. And I bring this up because I think it points to something really central within the Buddha's teachings on morality. The Buddha pointed many times to the connection between Sila and joy. And it's not the joy coming from getting a golden stamp of being a good person in the eyes of other people or maybe God. It's the joy that comes directly from knowing and seeing within ourselves that when we practice deep Sila, we actually feel happy. we feel joyful, we feel peaceful. And I think we can all intuit that when we do good, we feel good. So maybe we can trust that the Buddha's teaching on morality is not so much about being a good person or a bad person. Rather, it's based in the law of karma. It's really about what's skillful on this path and what is not skillful, what is forward leading on this path and what's not forward leading. And it turns out that being well founded in morality is both skillful and forward leading, and it's joyful at the same time. So the Buddha called this the bliss of blamelessness. And in the Anguttara Nikaya, he says, and what is the bliss of blamelessness? There is a situation where a practitioner is endowed with blamelessness of bodily action, blameless verbal action, blameless mental action, and knowing this, she reflects, I am endowed with blameless bodily action, with blameless mental action, with blameless verbal action, and then she experiences bliss, she experiences joy, and this is called the bliss of blamelessness. So as I said earlier, this theme of this talk really is the connection between Sila and joy. So as mentioned earlier, taking the 5 precepts together is the most obvious type of Sila practice that we're doing together here in retreat. These 5 precepts dates all the way back to the Buddha, who offered them to both lay people and monastics to practice in daily life and as a support for meditation. Of course, many monastics take many more precepts. My understanding is that some monastic takes hundreds of them. I'm not sure exactly how many they take, but many. And for some of you, you're not just taking the 5 precepts here, you're taking 8 precepts. But what I wanted to focus on is these 5 precepts that the Buddha himself called the 5 faultless gifts. So with the first precept, we train not to harm or kill any living beings. So on retreat, this often means that we may switch to eating a vegetarian meal. Although in a daily life we may have meat or fish included in our diet. And this is how we really protect life. We may also be really careful with insects when we walk around inside or outside. And we take really great care that we don't accidentally take the life of another being. With the second precept, we train not to steal, not to take what's not given freely. And in some ways, it's quite obvious for many of us not to steal. We usually know quite well what belongs to ourselves and what belongs to another person. So in some ways, this can seem very obvious. Yet on retreat, we may become way more sensitive to what stealing means on a deeper level, what it means to take something that's not freely offered to us. I remember practicing on a long retreat at the Forest Refuge. And for some of you that's been there know that there's this yogi shelf. And this is a shelf where other yogis will offer things to each other, and they're offered freely, so you can take them as you need them. And I was having a cold at the time, and someone had to put a whole bunch of vitamin C powders on the shelf. There were many of them. And thinking that I would be struggling with this cold for multiple days, I took 3 at the same time, although I was only going to take 1 that day, but I took 3. Thinking, okay, now I'm secure. I have vitamin C for multiple days if I need it. And as I came to my room, I was hit with this remorse. I was realizing that some of the other yogis might not get vitamin C powders because I had taken more than I actually needed. And other people might do the same. And then there might be yogis that wouldn't get to have any vitamin C powder. So I decided to bring them back, the 2 of them, and trust that there would be more if I actually needed them, and also to trust that I would be okay if there wasn't any more the following day. With the third precept, we train to not engage in any harmful sexual activity. And on retreat, of course, we refrain from any kind of sexual activity. So one could easily think, okay, now it's all good. We're refraining from the act of sexual activity. But as a Dhamma teacher in training, I was recently assisting a retreat with a bunch of young people. And it turned out that several of them really felt intruded upon by the way that they were being looked at, gazed upon by other yogis. So although it was very subtle, there was this sense of someone intruding by maybe having lust in their mind as they were looking at each other. And this, in a very sensitive place, when we meditate, can actually feel harmful. So this is another way that we might really sensitize ourselves to what it means to not engage in harmful sexual activity. With the fourth precept, we train not to speak falsely. And again, it's quite often very obvious to us not to tell a direct lie. But there are so many other ways that we may still be unskillful with our speech. We may speak harshly, we may speak too much, we may speak at the wrong time, or we may speak with an unskillful motivation. So on the retreat, we don't have much outer speech except for the teacher interviews. And this is actually a way where we can practice working with our speech. So before talking, we may ask ourselves, is it totally accurate what I'm actually saying here? Is it clear? Is it useful? Is it timely? Will this speech I'm engaging in, will this actually support my practice? I remember a Dhamma talk I heard by Kamala Masters on the topic of right speech, and it really stood out to me. She was sharing that one of her teachers, Sayadaw U Pandita, had reminded his students that if we can't speak the truth, we can't actually experience the truth. So this is a really good point, I think. To progress on this path, we need to be really, really honest with our practice, both to ourselves and to others. Else we just get caught in stories around our practice, which is not really useful. So we can also practice with inner speech, noticing the inner chatter, the inner commenting, the inner judging voice that we often have. And we may see if we can also practice renunciation around this inner speech. So again, we're not pushing away the speech, we're not pushing away the chatter, but we're just slightly seeing if we can disengage from it a little bit, and we can let all the thoughts and all the chatter in the mind move through the mind like clouds in the sky. With the fifth precept, we train to not take intoxicants that cloud the mind. So on retreat, it's pretty obvious to us to avoid alcohol, and for some of us, we may even avoid caffeine. But we may start to notice how sensitive our clarity to mind is even to the impact of various foods and drinks that we ingest. Certain foods may make us really relaxed and sometimes sluggish, and it can be a pleasant type of numbing out, sort of like a type of food coma that we sometimes get from some of the food that we eat. And other foods may give us an energy kick, such as sugars or chocolate. And these types of foods may really throw us out of balance. And in some ways, in a subtler way than alcohol, they may in some ways cloud our minds. And this clouding of the mind can prevent us from developing our own inner balancing by actually bringing mindful awareness to our experience. This is the fine tuning of the string instrument that Marcia was talking about in her guidance today. So initially, we can think of Sila practice as a top-down set of guidelines that supports our commitment to non-harming behavior. Even with this outer control, there may still be many unwholesome thoughts in our mind streams. We may still judge someone really harshly on the inside, but it's really good and wholesome for us to not engage in acting on the thoughts. The Buddha taught us that the karmic consequences are much more severe when we outwardly act on a harmful thought than when we just practice keeping them to ourselves. And this makes a lot of sense, because when we openly attack or judge another person, we're harming two people, two beings. We're harming ourselves with the harshness and the intention, the harmful intentions within our own minds, but we're also harming the other being. And this is weighty karma. So with time, as this purification process continues, our inner motivations to act in wholesome or unwholesome ways becomes increasingly clear and visible to us. We start to see the intentions that give rise to our actions much more clearly. And we start to be able to track the direct impact that our intentions have on our mind stream. And we see very clearly that we're causing inner harm as well as outer harm with some of these unwholesome intentions. One of the ways that this sensitivity grows is what I call ouch. The ouch we feel when we speak or act in harmful ways. It's like the ouch I felt with the vitamin C powders as I was walking into my room. I had this, it hit me with this remorse, this ouch feeling. So I wanted to share a story about a really big ouch that I experienced a few years ago in my practice. And my hope is that it can be of support to you. So again, I was on a long retreat at the Forest Refuge, and for months I had been doing a concentration practice. So the mind had gotten quite still and quite sensitive. And at some point I switched my practice to this practice called the Four Elements practice, which is really noticing the four elements of wind, air, earth, and fire within the body. And I started noticing that when I made an intention for something to arise within the practice, there was an almost immediate response. So intending for joy, joy would arise. Intending for calm, calm would arise. And this is what can sometimes happen when the mind is secluded and concentrated. So with this Four Elements practice, I was noticing that when I invited the wind quality, it would get very strong and very noticeable right away. And then seeing this in the mind, there was some strange fascination that arose within the mind with this, wow, when I intend this, this is happening. And it was in the middle of February and I was feeling a bit cold. And then this devilish voice came into my head. It was saying, what would happen if right now you intended for more fire? Then maybe you would feel less cold. And in that moment, the previous wholesome intention to just practice, notice, and follow the instructions changed to one of playing with the powers of the concentrated mind. In my case, literally playing with fire, because I was wishing for fire. And as I heard the intention play out in my mind, wishing for more heat, a huge blast of heat completely overtook my whole body. And I felt like I was burning up, just burning up. My whole body was just fire, 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 fire. And I got a lot more than I asked for. And then a huge fear overtook my mind, and my heart was beating very, very fast. I was literally burning up from my own unwholesome intentions. And then the next thing that happened was this black cobra shot up in front of my face. Of course, it was my own mind making up this image. And it was just staring me down, this black cobra. And I felt like it was saying, don't you dare play with these forces of concentration, with these powers of the mind. And of course, again, it was my own mind making up this image. But it was a powerful image of Sila being present in my mind. It was almost like my own mind protecting me from going down a really unwholesome path. So I'm not telling you this story to scare you or just because it's a good story. I'm sharing it because it really shows the importance of impeccable Sila as we move deeper into these practices. Strong Sila is really necessary for the mind to open to deeper concentration and to deeper wisdom. And when the mind gets really sensitive, any moral transgressions becomes really enlarged and really noticeable to us. So the Buddha talked about the two moral guardians of the world called Hiri and Ottappa. I recently read an article in the Tricycle magazine describing these two guardians as the superheroes of Buddhism. And I just love this. I've always had this, since I heard about them the first time, I always had this sense of this Hiri and Ottappa on each side of me being these superheroes. So that made a lot of sense to me. And as superheroes, they protect our community and our hearts from inner and outer harm. They fight for harmony and they fight for peace. And of course, they're not outer protectors. They're really inner constellations, inner habit patterns protecting us from wrongdoing. So Hiri is often translated as moral shame, but it's not the type of toxic shame or self-loathing that we often think about when we talk about shame. Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated Hiri as a sense of inner conscientiousness. So it's like an inner compass that protects our own values. So, for example, we might feel a sense of moral shame when we think about cheating on our taxes. I know I have sometimes. And although we may feel that no one in particular will suffer from this cheating, and we're pretty sure that we won't be found out, we feel this moral shame because we're not aligned with our own inner values around truthfulness and honesty. It's said that the proximate cause for Hiri to arise is self-respect. So out of respect for our own values, our own integrity, our own hearts, we refrain from behaviors that hurt others or hurt ourselves. Ottappa is often translated as moral dread or moral fear, and this is a form of social awareness. It's a form of social awareness that's alerting us when we are transgressing social guidelines, social norms, and thereby potentially harming other people, harming other beings. And it's really a healthy fear that others might reject us or be upset with us as we engage in certain behaviors. This Ottappa, this moral dread, shows us something really important about our interconnection with each other. So it's not enough that we personally believe that our actions are not harmful. We may have really good intentions to not harm others. It's also how other people receive our actions. So based on our own values, we may be really well intended. Yet, if a particular person or community we're relating to perceive the action as insensitive or harmful, then it is harmful. We see this a lot with harm caused by a lack of understanding and respect around diversity and cultural differences. What is skillful and wholesome in one cultural context may not be skillful and wholesome in another cultural context. As a white-skinned, able-bodied, academically educated, cisgendered female, there are many things that I take for granted, values that I may hold and that I may express. And these values may actually be harmful to others with different social locations. So while I'm not intending to cause harm, we may still be causing harm. So we need to practice really deep listening so that we don't act out of ignorance or delusion. So as we're heading into many days of concentration practice, I wanted to talk a bit more about the connection between Sila and Samadhi. And to start, I would like to offer this teaching by the Buddha that he gave to his attendant and cousin Ananda. It's called The Rewards of Virtue. And this is a conversation between Ananda and the Buddha, so it goes back and forth. And Ananda starts, "What, O Venerable One, is the reward and blessing of wholesome morality?" And the Buddha responds, "Freedom from remorse, Ananda." And Ananda goes on, "And what is the outcome of freedom from remorse? It is joy, Ananda." "And what is then the outcome of joy? It is rapture, Ananda." "And what about the outcome of rapture? It is tranquility, Ananda. And what then is the outcome of tranquility? It is happiness, Ananda. And what's the outcome of happiness? It is concentration, Ananda. And then what's the outcome of concentration? It is vision and knowledge according to reality. And what is the outcome of vision and knowledge according to reality? That is turning away and detachment, Ananda. And what's the outcome of this turning away and this detachment? And the Buddha responds, it's the vision and knowledge with regard to liberation, Ananda. So here we see one of the many descriptions given by the Buddha pointing to the lawful linking between a cause and effect. So starting with virtue and leading all the way to concentration, wisdom, and full liberation. So if we just take the starting points of how freedom from remorse is leading to joy, we begin to have all the links leading to full liberation. So starting with joy, what is this joy that the Buddha is pointing to? And why is it so important? And why is it that we can't just find any good old thing to be joyful about? Can't we just be joyful about getting a car, going on vacation, or seeing a good friend? Can't we just use this joy and sit down and really meditate and concentrate our minds on the basis of this joy? And the reason why this probably won't work is that it is a particular kind of joy that the Buddha was talking about. It's a joy stemming from non-remorse, renunciation, non-harm, and right view. And this particular type of joy is said to be of an unworldly kind. It is unworldly because it doesn't condition patterns of attachment or gaining, but rather it stems from this renunciation and letting go that we are practicing as we're practicing with Sila. So as we each of us feel into this joy that the Buddha was pointing to, we can probably all feel that it has this quality of peace and quiet. It's not loud, it's not self-promoting. This type of unworldly joy already has the seed of wisdom in it. It has the power to uplift the mind and support the mind towards deeper and deeper letting go of attachments to worldly pleasures. And with this support, the mind can move into deeper and deeper seclusion and deeper states of concentration. So as it seems really skillful to reflect upon our own blamelessness as a source of wholesome joy, I would like to offer some concrete ways that we can bring this reflection into our practice here. How can we reflect on this bliss of blamelessness? Yet before doing that, I wanted to briefly talk about how we sometimes get in trouble with our Sila practice. So one of the ways that we may get in trouble is when we start to judge ourselves around immoral behaviors, and we really get entangled with these self-judgments. So we may, for example, feel a lot of remorse about things we've done in the past, or we may notice unskillful tendencies in the mind here and now. And then hearing these teachings on Sila, we may conclude, oh, my Sila is not good enough. I can never progress on this path. So while healthy remorse is really helpful in this practice, it's not so helpful to get lost in self-judgment. This just creates a strong sense of self around this, and this form of self-loathing in some ways is just another form of conceit. It's another form of I am. This is an I am bad, this type of I am. So it's much more useful to acknowledge past harm as we become aware of it, and then to take responsibility for our actions in the here and now. So in some ways, the one, meaning ourselves, who did the regrettable thing in the past is actually no longer here. The past self who did the harmful act did not have the knowledge and wisdom that is available for us today. If we did, we most likely would have not acted in that way. This became really clear to me in a conversation I recently had with a good friend. So she was talking about the tremendous guilt that she feels around how she parented her children when they were young. And as she was talking, I was recalling similarly unskillful things that I have also done as a parent. Yet, what I was noticing was that there was not this sense of heavy guilt or shame that I sensed in my friend as she was talking. And as I reflected in this conversation, I did notice that there was a sincere acknowledgement of the harm that had happened. So there was an acknowledgement, there was remorse around the harm that had happened. But there was no deep sense of an inherently bad self that came up in that conversation. And that's comes from that sense that that the actions back then, in some ways, I can feel remorseful about them and I can take responsibility for them in the here and now. But this current Kristina right here, in some ways, she can't be responsible for the past Kristina that didn't know better at the time. So this is where the Buddha's teachings on the selfless nature of existence are really helpful. When harm is happening, it is due to causes and conditions. In my case, past family conditioning and a lack of clear seeing and wisdom. So from the Buddha Dhamma perspective, it doesn't really make sense to blame ourselves. It's much more effective to acknowledge the harm, to forgive our past self for not knowing better, and then to start again in this very moment, dedicating ourselves to safety, to care, and to harmlessness of body and mind. So as the Buddha suggested, we can practice remembering our own virtue, our own goodness. And the first thing we can remember is that there already has to be a lot of wholesome qualities in the mind stream for us to be drawn to the teachings of the Buddha. For us to want to sit down and practice meditation, there has to be some level of Sila already here, or we probably couldn't stand to sit down and watch our mind day after day. So from a conventional point of view, there is absolutely nothing to get from this practice. As we discover, it's all about letting go. And the mind actually has to be purified to a significant degree for us to be oriented towards this letting go. Day after day, sitting and walking, we practice letting go. Another thing we can do is to deeply and authentically take the precepts every day as we do at the beginning of each Dhamma talk. We can practice really letting the words sink in, and we can fully give ourselves over to the words. We can invite ourselves to deeply trust them, and then we can start to notice the potential effect inwardly and outwardly. We can also notice our own deepening sensitivity to Sila as it grows as we engage in this practice. So this deepening happens all on its own, yet when we skillfully pay attention to wholesome states, they do tend to grow. We also may start to notice the sting of harmful inner speech, the way we often talk to ourselves about ourselves, or talk to ourselves about others or the worlds around us. And we can practice letting go of this inner speech out of care for ourselves and other beings. And then we can actively reflect on this bliss of blamelessness, the inner joy that comes with this deep Sila. So we may take a moment each day and reflect, oh, today was a day where there was less harm. There was less harm to others, less harm to self. Especially on this retreat, there probably is less harm happening. And can we quietly celebrate this and feel a sense of dignity and healthy joy around it? So I'd like to end this talk today with an invitation by the Buddha to us. So you may, if this feels right for you, you may actually close your eyes and take in these words as a type of meditation. And it's a part of a sutta, and it's called Recalling Your Own Virtues. There is a case where you recollect your own virtues. You remember that they are untorn, they're unbroken, they're unspotted, they're unsplattered, they're liberating, They're praised by the wise, they're untarnished, and they are conducive to concentration. At that time, when you recollect your own virtue, your mind is not overcome with passion, it's not overcome with aversion, and it's not overcome with delusion. Your mind heads straight, based in virtue. And when your mind is headed straight, you get a deeper sense of the goal. You gain a sense of the Dhamma. You gain a joy connected with the Dhamma. And when you're joyful, then rapture arises. And when there's rapture, your body grows very calm. And when your body is very calm, experiences become easeful. And when you feel ease, the mind becomes concentrated. So let's sit together quietly for a moment. Thank you for listening to the Dhamma. And now we'll chant together the sharing of the blessings. I'll just give you a moment to pull it out. Through the goodness that arises from my practice, may my spiritual teachers and guides of great virtue, my mother, my father, and my relatives, the sun and the moon, and all virtue's leaders of the world, may the highest gods and evil forces, celestial beings, guardian spirits of the earth, and the Lord of death, may those who are friendly, indifferent, or hostile, may all beings receive the blessings of my life. May they soon attain the threefold bliss and realize the deathless. Through the goodness that arises from my practice, and through this act of sharing, may all desires and attachment quickly cease, and all harmful states of mind, until I realize Nibbana in every kind of birth. May I have an upright mind, with mindfulness and wisdom, austerity and vigor. May the forces of delusions not take hold, nor weaken my resolve. The Buddha is my excellent refuge. Unsurpassed is the protection of the Dhamma. The solitary Buddha is my noble Lord. The Sangha is my supreme support. Through the supreme power of all of these, may darkness and delusion be dispelled.